The rotten plank gave way without warning, and Gideon Winslow's boot punched through the edge of the cliffside walkway with a crack like a snapped femur, and then there was nothing beneath his left foot but 40 feet of open air and the cold gray churn of the Mosswater Delta below. He did not scream. He had no breath left for screaming. His hands clawed at the slick wooden railing, found nothing but splinters, and his body tilted outward over the edge with the slow, horrible certainty of a felled tree. The world tipped. The brown expanse of the delta swung into his vision where the sky should have been. He was gone. Then a hand closed around his arm, not a grip, not a catch. A clamp, iron-hard fingers that closed above his elbow and simply stopped him the way a cliff face stops a rolling stone, without drama, without effort, as if the physics of his falling had simply encountered something immovable. His whole weight wrenched against that grip and his shoulder burned with the sudden arrest, but he did not fall. He hung over the edge for one suspended, eternal heartbeat, looking down at the dark water and the reed-choked shallows, and then the hand hauled him backward onto the walkway as casually as pulling a fish from a net. He hit the planking on hands and knees, gasping. His heart was somewhere in his throat. His palms were bleeding from the splinters. He stayed there for a moment, just breathing, feeling the solid boards beneath him with a love he had never felt for any inanimate surface in his 28 years of life. He became aware that the hand had not let go. It was still on his arm, above the elbow, wrapped around him with a grip that was firm but not painful now. He turned his head. She was crouched beside him on the walkway, one knee down, her other boot braced against the good planking, and she was watching him with an expression that might have been concern or might have been appraising calculation. It was difficult to tell because her face was not a human face, and he was still too shaken to read it properly. She was an orc woman, tall even in her crouch, broad in the shoulder and long in the limb, with skin the color of deep river moss after rain, a rich and textured green-gray that caught the thin morning light coming off the water. Her hair was dark, almost black, pulled back in a thick practical braid that had come half loose in the morning wind. Her eyes were amber, not the warm amber of firelight but the sharp, cold amber of river water over dark stone, the kind of eyes that missed nothing. She wore fitted warrior's leathers, a close-cut bodice of dark-stitched hide that laced up the center of her chest, form-following and practical at once, paired with snug traveling trousers tucked into knee-high boots with brass buckles. A short sword rode her left hip and a long knife her right. The leathers were not new. They had been oiled and re-oiled, patched in 2 places, worn in a way that said she had lived in them for a long season. They fit her the way a second skin fits, every line of her form present and unapologetic. There were old blade marks on the leather at her ribs and a newer one at the forearm she had just used to save his life. She was looking at him. He was still on his knees. He realized with a start that several seconds had passed and he had not said a single word. "You ought to test the planking before you walk on it," she said. Her voice was low and unhurried, with the faint guttural undertone common to orc speech, but her words were clear and precise. "Especially on the outer walkways. The salt rot moves faster than people think." "I know that," he said, which was both true and stupid because he had just demonstrated the opposite with spectacular effect. "I thank you. That was, you were going over." She said it simply, like a fact about the weather. "Yes. You would have died, probably." She looked at him for another moment. Then with a deliberateness he could not have explained even afterward, she released his arm. Not dropped it, released it. Her fingers uncurled one by one and she drew her hand back, and the absence of that grip was immediate and strange, like the end of a sound you had not realized you had been hearing. She stood. He climbed to his feet, somewhat less gracefully, and found that she was taller than him by nearly a head. Most orc women were not as tall as orc men, but this one had enough of the clan's blood in her height to make him feel distinctly average standing beside her. He was not a small man, 5'10", rope muscled from years of poling his barge along the delta channels with the kind of lean, weathered strength that has no particular appearance from a distance but becomes obvious up close. Beside her, he felt ordinary. He felt, in fact, exactly what he was. "Gideon Winslow," he said, and held out his hand. She looked at the hand, then she looked at him, then she took it and shook it once firmly. "Sharamph Bonecrusher." He did not flinch at the name, which he suspected she noticed. "You are the ferryman," she said. "It was not a question. I was told you run the deep channel route, Mosswater to the Thresh landing." "And back," he said. "What can I do for you?" She studied him with those amber eyes for a moment that stretched just past comfortable. Then she said, "I need passage south, Thresh landing or wherever the channel ends. I have coin." "When?" "This morning." He looked out over the delta. The morning was gray and damp. The way mornings in the Mosswater Delta were 9 days in 10. The reed channels wound out from the stilt town of Havenbrook in every direction, their surfaces flat and brown, broken by stands of tall gray-green reed and the occasional dark hump of a spoil island. It was no day for pleasure sailing. But it was a perfectly ordinary day for running cargo south, which was what he had been intending to do anyway. "Then we go this morning," he said. He turned toward the barge dock at the near end of the walkway. She fell into step beside him without invitation, which he appreciated more than he could have articulated. The barge was called the Mudhen, which its owner had considered a fine name when he had built it 12 years ago, and still considered a fine name despite considerable evidence that passengers did not. It was a flat-bottomed river barge 40 feet long, wide in the beam, with a low cargo hold beneath deck boards and a canvas awning that covered the stern third in variable weather. Gideon had inherited it from his father, along with the route, the accounts, and the particular knowledge of which channels ran deep enough to navigate in dry season, and which would ground you with a sound like a dying sigh if you misjudged. He had been running the Delta since he was 17, first as crew, then as his father's second, then alone. He knew the Mosswater Delta the way other men knew their own houses in the dark, by feel, with a certainty that was not thought but simply knowledge. He was loading the last of a cargo commission when Sharamph came down the dock to join him. It was mostly wrapped bundles of preserved reed cloth and 2 crated jars of brine-cured river fish, the kind of undramatic commerce that kept the Delta's stilt villages alive. She did not offer to help. She stood on the dock and watched him work, and then when he moved to cast off the bow line, she stepped aboard without being invited and settled herself on the forward cargo block with her long legs stretched out before her and her elbows on her knees. He did not tell her where to sit. She seemed like a woman who would find the right place on her own. He took his pole and pushed off from the dock, and the Mudhen moved out into the main channel with the quiet slipping sound of a thing that belongs to water. The morning fog was burning off the reed beds in thin gray curls. Somewhere in the reeds a marsh bird was making its wet, plaintive cry. The channel wound ahead of them, brown and still. He worked in silence for a while, poling from the stern. She sat forward and watched the channel ahead with what appeared to be genuine interest, not the distracted vacancy of a passenger waiting to arrive somewhere, but the active attention of someone taking in information. She marked the junctions in the channel when they passed them. She watched the reed lines at the bank. She turned once when a great gray heron launched from a spoil island ahead, its wings enormous in the low light, and the expression on her face as she watched it go was something he did not expect, quiet, unguarded, struck open for just a moment by the sheer indifferent beauty of the bird. Then she turned back to the channel and her face closed up again. "Where are you from?" He asked because he knew how to work and talk at the same time, and the silence had reached a kind that needed to be broken. "The Greenscar Clan," she said. "Eastern Highlands, 3 weeks' travel from here. Long way to come to need a ferry." She glanced back at him. "People travel." "They do," he agreed. "Looking for someone or avoiding someone?" "Both," she said, and then nothing further, and he recognized that for what it was and did not press. He worked the pole and the mud hen moved south through the channels. The morning warmed slowly. Herons and egrets worked the shallows beside them. Once a family of river otters crossed their bow in a sleek brown line. The reed beds gave way in stretches to open water where the channel widened, and in these open stretches you could see the sky full and gray above you and the dark line of Spoil Islands ahead, and the world felt very large and very quiet. He had run this route alone for 6 years. He was used to the quiet, but there was something different about the quiet with her in it. He found himself watching the back of her neck where the braid had come loose and a few strands of dark hair moved in the river wind. He made himself look at the channel instead. "You said I ought to test the planking," he said after a while. "How did you know the planking was rotten? You arrived on that walkway right after I did." She was quiet for a moment. "I saw you tense before you stepped onto it. You felt the give before it broke. And the wood was visibly darker at the edge. That is what salt rot looks like before it gives." He thought about that. "You saved me before you knew you were going to," he said. She turned on her perch to look at him then, a full half-turn, one arm hooked over the cargo block. Her expression was unreadable in the way things are unreadable when they are complicated rather than blank. "I grabbed you," she said carefully, "because you were going over and I was standing there. I did not calculate it." "I know," he said. "That is what I mean." She held his gaze for a beat. Then she turned back to face the channel, and he thought he saw the line of her jaw shift, as if she had almost said something and decided against it. He let it go. They reached the first way station at mid-morning, a cluster of 3 stilt houses, and a landing stage at the junction of the South Run and the Thresh Channel, run by a man named Bort Calloway who sold warm porridge and watered-down river ale, and knew every piece of news that moved through the Delta's southern reaches. Gideon brought the mud hen in gently and made fast with the ease of long habit. Bort was on his landing stage, and his eyes went to Sharamph with the sharp, measuring look that Gideon had seen humans give orcs 1,000 times in this region. The look that was not quite hostility yet, but was no kind of welcome either. Havenbrook and the Delta settlements were not clan country. There had been border raids out of the Highlands 3 years back, and the memory of that was still raw in places. "Morning, Gideon," Bort said. He did not acknowledge Sharamph. "Morning, Bort. I have 2 boxes and a bundle for Thresh and a passenger riding through." He said it easy and plain, no apology in his voice, no emphasis that asked permission. He had learned early that the best way to handle moments like this was to make them boring. Bort's eyes moved to Sharamph again. She met his look with the flat calm of a woman who had been looked at like that before, and had decided some time ago that it cost her nothing. "There are fever boats coming up from the south," Bort said, still looking at her. 2 more settlements sealed off down Delta. They are saying it is the cressworm." Gideon went still. Beside him he felt rather than saw Sharamph's attention sharpen. "The cressworm," he repeated. "That has not been in the Delta since before my father's time." "Well, it is back," Bort said. He poured 2 bowls of porridge without being asked and set them on the landing stage rail, the orc woman's portion no smaller than Gideon's. Whatever Bort's look had been, he was not the kind of man to let someone go hungry. 3 settlements, possibly 4. It comes on fast high fever, then the cramping, then the lungs fill up. They say 6 days is a long time to last once it takes hold. Gideon took his porridge. He watched Sharamph take hers from the rail. She picked it up without looking at Bort, without warmth or coldness, just took the food she needed. There was a dignity to it that struck him. "Is the Thresh landing sealed?" he asked. "Not yet, but they are close to it." Bort finally looked at Gideon directly. "There is trouble down there, Gid. Not just the sickness. People scared of sickness. People who need to eat but cannot fish because the channels near the sealed towns are quarantined. They are getting mean about it. Had a merchant beat off his dock 3 days ago by a crowd. Be careful." Gideon ate and thought about this. He looked at Sharamph. She was finishing her porridge with the methodical efficiency of someone who treated eating as a task to be completed rather than a pleasure to be lingered over. She was watching the southern channel. "I still need to deliver the cargo," he said, quietly, to her more than to Bort. but I will understand if you want to wait here." She handed her empty bowl back to Bort with a small nod that was something adjacent to courtesy. "I am not here to wait," she said to Gideon. He did not argue. He pushed off from Bort's landing stage and turned the mudhen south. The morning of his trip, he would think afterward, was where the story really started. Not on the rotten walkway where she had saved his life, though that was where it had technically begun, but on the water, moving south through a delta that was quietly becoming afraid. The plague changed everything in the Mosswater settlements. It was not the sickness that made men cruel. It was the fear of the sickness, the fear of scarcity and contagion, and the chaos that comes when people who have lived in settled proximity to one another suddenly begin to wonder if their neighbor's touch could kill them. He had seen a version of it once, 6 years ago, when a grain blight had hit the upper settlements and the stored food had run short. People had become territorial about their channels, about their fishing grounds, about their stores. Men he had known since boyhood had become men he did not recognize. He had navigated that season by keeping his head down and his barge moving and his mouth shut, and he had kept most of his accounts and lost none of his integrity. And when the blight broke and the next harvest came in, people had been grateful and somewhat ashamed and tried to put it behind them. This felt worse. He could see it in the channels as they moved south, fewer boats out, and the ones that were out were moving fast with their cargo covered and their owners not meeting eyes. The landing stages they passed were more defended than usual, men with boat hooks visible where there had never been boat hooks before. In one village, Reedholm, 3 hours south of Havenbrook, there was a fever flag posted on the outer dock, the red and black that meant quarantine in force. They did not stop there. Gideon moved the mudhen along the far side of the channel with his pole steady and his face forward. Sharamph watched Reedholm pass with those amber eyes and said nothing. It was in the early afternoon, with the sun somewhere behind the cloud cover trying to warm the delta and not quite managing it, that she said, "You have been doing this a long time, this route." "All my life, essentially," he said. "My father built the mudhen, I grew up on it." "Where is your father now?" "Dead," he said without particular drama. 4 years ago, his heart." She was quiet for a moment. "You have no one else?" "I have accounts," he said, which was meant to be a deflection but came out instead as the thing it actually was, which was a small, dry admission that the accounts were in fact his primary company most days. He felt her look at him and looked away at the channel. "The Greenscar Clan," she said slowly, as if choosing what to give him, "is not small. I have more company than I want most of the time." "Is that why you left?" Another pause. "In part, then, I am Warchief Trena's oath warrior, or I was. Trena died in the spring. When a warchief dies without naming a successor, the oath bonds release. I have been." She turned the word in her mouth, "loose." "Since then." "Loose," he repeated. "It is not a comfortable way to be," she said. He understood that, he thought. He had been loose since his father died. Not unmoored exactly. The barge and the route and the accounts kept him tethered, but loose from any larger sense of purpose or belonging. The barge was a life. He was not sure it was quite a meaning. "Where are you going?" he asked. "At the end of the run, Thresh Landing, and then," she looked out at the reeds, "there is a clan further south. The Mudfoot clan, they live in the delta permanently, reed houses and stilts and all of it. I have kin there, a cousin." She paused. "I did not know if I would come. I have been walking toward it for weeks, stopping, turning back, walking again. And today." She met his eyes then, and there was something in her look that was neither closed nor open, but exactly on the edge between the two. "Today, I decided to come the rest of the way." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he looked back at the channel and worked his pole and did not say anything further, because some things did not need a reply. They reached Thresh Landing in the late afternoon. It was a larger settlement than most of the delta waypoints, a proper town of 40 stilt houses and a row of canal front warehouses, with a covered market that ran along the main water street, and a tavern called the Muddled Eel that smelled of lamp oil and river fish from 40 feet away. There were two large cargo docks and a smaller passenger dock, and at the end of the passenger dock, a crowd of about 30 people that Gideon read as trouble approximately 10 seconds before the mudhen pulled level with it. He did not stop at the cargo dock. He tied up at a side landing stage 100 feet short of the main dock, moved the cargo boxes off with quick efficiency, and was straightening up when the crowd's attention found them. Most of it was about the plague. He could hear it in the voices even before he could make out the words. That particular high-wound tone that frightened people use when they have been frightened for too long and need somewhere to put it. Something about the fever coming up the channels. Something about sealed boats, tainted water. Something about strangers bringing it with them. Then someone in the crowd saw Sharamph. He had navigated this delta for 28 years, and he knew exactly how quickly a crowd's direction could change when it found a target. He saw it happen in the space of 3 seconds, the murmur that went through the group like wind through reeds, the heads that turned, the single voice that said loudly, "Orc witch," which was both a slur and an accusation in one compact, ugly package. Sharamph did not react. She stood on the landing stage beside the stacked cargo with her arms loose at her sides and her face so perfectly neutral it was almost a provocation. She was taller than every man in that crowd, and they knew it, and it made them angrier. Gideon stepped forward to stand between her and the dock. He was not a fighter. He had a knife, the way all Delta men had knives, because the Delta had things in it that sometimes needed a knife. He was not afraid of the crowd exactly, but he was deeply respectful of what a crowd in this state could do if it decided to move. He stood on the landing stage's edge and he addressed them with the plain, undecorated authority of a man who has been running these channels for 10 years and has done business with most of the faces he was looking at. "Afternoon," he said. "I have cargo for Thresh Landing. I have a passenger. Cressworm does not travel by orc. It travels by water and by touch, same as it always has. You know that and I know that. Back up." A long beat. The crowd breathed. An older man near the front, heavyset, weathered, a dockmaster's stamp on his coat, spoke with more reason than the rest of them. "No one is saying different, Winslow, but people are scared and they want to know who is moving through. There are quarantine rules in place." "I know the rules," Gideon said. "I follow them. She is not sick and neither am I, and you can look at us both and know it. The cargo has been checked at waypoints." Another pause. The crowd's energy shifted, not gone but directionless now, looking for somewhere to settle. Gideon did not move. He stayed in front of Sharamph on the dock, his knife not drawn, his voice not raised, his body language absolutely refusing to be interesting. Behind him, very quietly, Sharamph said, "The dock master is right that there should be checking. I have no objection to it." He glanced back at her. She was looking at the dock master with a directness that bypassed the shouting edges of the crowd entirely, speaking only to the one figure with authority in it. There was something remarkable about how she did that, how she simply excised the noise and addressed the signal. The dock master nodded slowly. "Then come through the inspection stage same as everyone." They did. It was fast and perfunctory. A man with a lantern looking at their eyes, their skin, listening to their breathing. The river doctor's quick standard of plague screening, worth as much as it was worth, which was not very much against a sickness still incubating. But it satisfied the crowd's procedural appetite, and the crowd dispersed back to its separate fears. Gideon delivered his cargo to the warehouse. He settled accounts with the factor there, a thin woman named Pell who had been managing Thresh Landing's warehouse since before he was born, and who gave Sharamph the same measuring look as Bort had given her, and the same kind of food, hard cheese and river bread, set out on the warehouse counter without ceremony. Gideon watched Pell do this and felt something warm and unnameable toward the old woman. Outside, the afternoon was fading toward a cold, damp evening. He looked at Sharamph on the dock. "The Mudfoot clan is a half-day further south," he said. "I can run you tomorrow morning. The light will be too bad by the time we push off today." She looked south down the channel for a moment, then she looked at him. "You do not need to go further. "I have a return cargo to pick up at Mudfoot Station," he said, which was partly true and partly an excuse that they both recognized as an excuse and both pretended to take at face value. She nodded once. "Then we go in the morning." The Muddled Eel had rooms above the tavern, reed mattress bunks in small plank-walled spaces, and Gideon knew the owner well enough to get 2 of them without much negotiation. He ate in the tavern common room, a bowl of Delta fish soup that was mostly hot water with ambitions, and Sharamph sat across from him at the low table and ate the same thing, and they talked for the first time without the motion of the barge between them, without the work of the channel as a reason to look away. He learned that she had been Trena's oath warrior for 9 years, since she was 22. He learned that she had fought in the border raids 3 years back, on the Greenscar side, which made his jaw go a little tight, and then untight when she said, without flinching from it, "I am not proud of everything I did in those years. Trena was building something that I believed in. Not all of what we did to build it was right." She paused. "I am telling you this because you have family in the Delta and some of those raids came through here and you have a right to know who is on your barge." He thought about that. He thought about the canal side at Reedholm and the family there, the Haskells, who had lost their eldest son in a Highland raid 2 years back. He thought about what honesty cost. "I appreciate that," he said, and he meant it without reservation. "Do you?" She was watching him carefully. "Yes," he said. "I have never been in a war. I do not know what I would have done in one. I know what I would like to think I would have done, but I was not there." Picked up his bowl and drank the last of the broth. "You are on my barge. You are honest with me. That is what matters to me today." She was quiet for a long moment. The tavern noise moved around them, low conversations, the clink of bowls, the creak of the floor timbers in the night wind off the Delta. Her amber eyes were on his face with a steadiness that felt like something deliberate, like a choice. "You are unusual," she said finally. "So I have been told," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the family of smiles. He woke in the night to raised voices from the dock side, 3 or 4 of them, and looked out his window to see a lantern swinging, and what looked like 2 men arguing with another over a boat. Not his problem. He lay back down on the reed mattress and stared at the plank ceiling and thought about a woman who had saved him from falling and then sat across from him and told him her worst truths before he had asked for them. And he lay there for a long time before he slept. In the morning she was already on the dock when he came down, standing in the early light with her braid retied and her boots buckled, and a look about her that said she had slept lightly and woken resolved. And she looked at him when he came down the dock ladder, and the expression on her face was one he could not fully read but was not entirely indifferent. They pushed off south. The southern delta was different from the northern reaches. Wider water, slower channels, the reed beds thicker and taller, the spoil islands more numerous and more thickly vegetated. There were herons everywhere. The light came in low and sideways in the morning and turned the water bronze and the reeds gold, and after an hour of poling the mudhen through it, Gideon found himself thinking that it was beautiful in the particular way that things are beautiful when you have been seeing them too long alone. "Tell me about the Mudfoot clan," he said. She had moved to the stern by mid-morning, to his end of the barge, and she was sitting on the stern rail watching him work. He had noticed she moved around the barge as the day went on, testing it, understanding its space and weight, which was something a person did when they were interested in how things worked. He liked that. "They came into the Delta before my mother was born," she said. "A small clan, 40 families at the most, and they built into the Delta instead of fighting for highland ground. They fish, they harvest reeds, they make things from bone and fiber that you cannot get anywhere else. My cousin Vreth has lived there since she was a girl." She paused. "Trena had no love for the Mudfoot clan, too peaceful for her purposes, but I used to think," she stopped. "Used to think what?" "That they were wise," she said simply. "Not weak, just wise." He polled in silence for a moment. "And now you are going to them." "Now I am going to them." He thought about what that meant, what it would mean, to choose the path you had privately thought was wise for a long time over the path you had been sworn to. He thought about how that kind of choice was also a kind of coming home, and how coming home was rarely as uncomplicated as it sounded. "I ran the Mudfoot Station route once before," he said. "A long time ago, when I was still crewing for my father. I was 20, maybe 21. She looked at him. "Once. My father had a contract for 3 seasons. Then he lost the contract, some argument about channel rights, and we stopped going south of Thresh Landing. This is the first time I have been back in 7 years." He glanced at her. "I remember the clan's dock, big stone marker on the right bank, carved with fish and reed patterns." "The clan marker," she said. "My cousin described it to me in her letters." He worked the pole and the morning moved around them, and the delta opened further into the wide, shallow confluence waters that preceded Mudfoot Station. He was thinking about the direction things took, the strange, crooked lines that connected one moment to another across years. He had been on this water once before. He had run south once in his father's company, and come back north and not come south again for 7 years. And now he was here again with a woman who had saved him from a broken walkway 24 hours ago and told him hard truths over bad soup. Then, at the junction of the South Confluence and the Thresh Outflow Channel, they found the hostage. He heard it before he saw it, a woman's voice, high and desperate, and then a man's voice raised in threat, and then the dull wooden thud of a boat being pushed against a dock piling. He rounded the reed point at the channel junction and saw a small landing stage with a wooden storage shed on it and 4 men on the dock and a woman, young, human, delta dress and bare feet, held by the collar by one of the men, who was holding a long dock knife to her throat. 3 more men stood between the dock and the channel, boat hooks down, and the scene had the look of something that had been building toward catastrophe for a while. Gideon brought the mudhen in quietly, matching his speed to the current, not announcing himself. He read the scene. The woman was the ferryman's daughter. He recognized the boat at the side of the dock, a small reed-hull craft, the kind that local families ran. The 4 men were not local. Their clothes were delta-adjacent but wrong, too heavy for river work, the boots wrong for walking wet dock stages. They were from somewhere inland and they were frightened and hungry, and they had decided that the storage shed on this dock held food or trade goods, and they intended to have it. Sharamph, beside him, had already read the scene in full. He could tell by the way she had gone very still and very alert, the way a thing that is powerful does when it has found the moment to be powerful. He was about to say something, what he was not sure, when one of the men with boat hooks spotted the mudhen and turned and shouted, and the man with the dock knife moved it slightly and the woman whimpered and everything got worse immediately. "Stay back," the man with the knife shouted. "Stay back or I open her throat and everyone finds out what comes after that." Gideon held the mudhen off with his pole. He was 20 feet from the dock. He kept his voice level. "Nobody needs that," he said. "You have an audience now and nobody here wants to see what you are threatening. Put the knife down and tell me what you need." "We need food," the man said. He was not a natural villain. Gideon could hear it in his voice, the desperation that had brought him to this moment, and was now very much wishing it had found a different road. "We need food and we need passage north, away from the fever zone. You are a ferryman, take us north." "I can take you north," Gideon said. "Let her go." A pause. The man with the knife was calculating, could he trust this? Could he afford not to trust this? His 3 companions were watching him for direction, and he knew it, and it was making him stiffer and more committed than he actually wanted to be. Then Sharamph stepped forward to the bow of the mudhen. She moved to the very front of the barge, and she stood there in plain view of all 4 men and the terrified woman, and she drew herself up to her full height, and she let all of them look at her, the leathers, the height, the short sword at her hip and the long knife at her thigh, and above all the amber eyes that were looking at the man with the dock knife with the complete, undivided attention of a warrior who has stood in worse places than this. "Let her go," Sharamph said. Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. It had the quality of the ground having said something, a bass, certain sound that did not threaten so much as it simply stated the future. The man's eyes moved from Gideon to Sharamph. He looked at her for a long, calculating moment. He was afraid. She could see that, and she used it, but not cruelly. She used it the way a navigator uses a current, letting it do the work. "And if I don't," he said. She held his gaze. "Then whatever happens next happens in full view of the ferryman and the dock woman and every bird on this marsh, and you become a man who has done a thing he cannot undo. Let her go, and you are still a man who has not quite crossed that line. That is a better thing to be." A long beat. The knife trembled. "I want passage north," he said again, less certain now. "You will have it," Sharamph said. "The ferryman said so. I am confirming it. Let her go." She stepped off the bow of the mud-hen onto the dock. This was the moment, not the words, but the move, the physical commitment of stepping off the barge and onto the dock with those 4 men, putting herself within reach of all of them, the short sword still on her hip and not drawn. She walked toward the man with the knife with the unhurried pace of a woman who knows exactly where she is going, and she put herself between him and the channel, and she looked at him at point-blank range. "Let her go," she said again. Quiet, final. The knife came down. The man's hand opened. The woman pulled free and ran to the far side of the dock, and Gideon brought the mud-hen in fast and got between the dock and the channel so she could step aboard. The man with the dock knife looked at Sharamph from 3 feet away, and she looked back at him, and there was a moment in which either thing could still have happened. And then he put the knife in his belt, and his shoulders came down, and he looked very tired and very young. "We have not eaten in 2 days," he said. "I know," she said. "Get on the barge." Gideon looked at her. She looked at him. A question passed between them without words, and he answered it with the smallest nod. "Yes, all right, we do this." They went north, all 4 of them, while the dockwoman watched from her landing stage with wide eyes and did not say a word. And Gideon fed the 4 men the last of the river bread he had in the mud-hen's locker, and Sharamph sat in the stern and watched the channels and did not speak until they had dropped the men at the nearest way station and pushed off again. When they were clear of the way station, she came back to the stern and stood near him at the pole. "That was well done," he said. "You were going to manage it yourself," she said. "Maybe you did it better." She looked at the channel for a while. "I have done worse versions of that scene," she said. "A lot worse. Years of Trena's campaigns." She paused. "I would rather do this version." He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon as he turned the mud-hen around and pushed south again toward Mudfoot Station. They reached the Mudfoot Station dock in the early evening, when the light had gone golden and flat across the wide water, and the carved stone clan marker stood on the right bank exactly as he remembered it. The fish and reed patterns worn softer by 7 years of rain, but still clear and deliberate. On the dock, a woman was waiting who might have been Sharamph's shadow, not in build, for she was shorter and narrower, her orc blood mixing differently, but in the look on her face when she saw the mud-hen come in. She had the same amber eyes, and they went to Sharamph immediately and did not leave her, and the expression in them was something so nakedly relieved that Gideon felt he was looking at something private and looked away. Sharamph stepped off the mud-hen onto the dock, and the 2 women clasped arms in the orc manner, forearm to forearm, a tight, brief hold, and then the shorter woman said something in the old clan tongue, rapid and low, and Sharamph answered in the same tongue, and he busied himself making fast the bow line and checking the stern line and doing approximately nothing with elaborate focus. Then Sharamph said, "Vreth, this is Gideon Winslow. He runs the Delta route." Vreth turned to him with the assessing look of a woman who has spent a life in the Delta reading people quickly. Then she nodded. "Ferryman, do you need a berth for the night?" "I have a return cargo to pick up," he said. "I will stay if the cargo can be loaded in the morning." "It can," she said. He ate with the Mudfoot clan that evening fish stew, real fish stew, made in clay pots over reed fire with herbs he did not know the names of, and the warmth of 40 people in a long, open-sided reed house above the water was something physical and immediate after the cold of the channels. He sat at the communal table and ate, and listened to voices around him in a language He mostly did not understand and felt something that was the opposite of lonely, which was not exactly happy but was adjacent to it. Sharamph sat across from him. Through the meal she talked with her cousin in the old tongue, and occasionally she translated for him without being asked. Not everything, just the things that were interesting. A story about an otter that had stolen an entire smoked fish from the drying rack. A question about what the channels had been like north of Thresh Landing. Small things. He felt each one as a small gift. After the meal, when the reed lamps were lit and the evening sounds of the delta were coming off the water, Sharamph came and stood beside him on the outer walkway of the stilt house, where he was looking out at the channel in the last of the gray light. "You are going back north in the morning," she said. "Yes." A pause. "The plague is worse in the north. Bort told you more than he told me, I think, in the way of it." "Probably," he said. "Havenbrook will get hit before the southern delta. The traffic is heavier." He looked at the water. "I have accounts up there, people I work for." "I know," she said. She was standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, which in the cool delta evening was substantial. She was very warm. He had not expected that, though he was not sure what he had expected. "You are staying here," he said, "not a question." "I am." She paused, "not deciding that tonight," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the channel with her jaw set in a way that meant she was thinking about something and not ready to give it to him yet. "The Mudfoot clan is where you meant to come," he said. "Yes, a beat. It is also the end of your run." He was quiet. The reeds moved in the night wind. A boat passed in the far channel, a red lantern at its stern. "Sharamph," he said, and the use of her name, the first time he had used it directly, made her turn to look at him. "If you want to come back north, the Mudhen goes north every week. You know the route now." She held his look for a long moment. In the lamplight, her amber eyes were dark and warm and very still. "I know the route," she said. He did not push. He went back to the Mudhen and slept in the hold the way he always slept when he was away from Havenbrook, on a bedroll over the cargo boards with the sounds of the water close around him. He lay there and thought about her standing on the dock of a broken walkway with her hand still on his arm and the danger already past, and he thought about how the hand had stayed. In the morning he loaded the return cargo, reed cloth and dried herbs, and 4 crates of the Mudfoot clan's bone-worked trade goods, and made ready to push north. Vreth came down to see him off with 2 packets of the dried herbs pressed into his hand, which was a form of generosity he accepted without argument. Sharamph came down to the dock with her pack on her shoulder. He looked at the pack. He looked at her. He did not say anything. She stepped onto the Mudhen without being asked and put her pack in the bow and sat on the cargo blocks and looked at him. He pushed off. The Mudhen turned north. 2 hours up the channel in a wide stretch of open water between reed beds, she said, "I am not returning because I have nowhere else to go." "I know that," he said. "I am returning because—" She stopped, tried again. "The Mudfoot clan is good. Vreth is good. I could build something there. But I spent last night thinking about what I was moving toward and what I was moving away from, and I realized that the direction that had me going north was the more honest direction." He held the pole steady. "What is north for you?" She looked at him with those amber eyes and did not look away. "You are north for me," she said. "At the moment. That may be too direct. I am told that humans prefer no," he said. "That is exactly the right amount of direct." She blinked. Then the corner of her mouth moved in the way he had seen once before, the not-quite smile that was nevertheless absolutely a smile. He worked the pole and the Mudhen moved north through the golden morning of the delta, and neither of them said anything for a long while. But the silence was a completely different kind of silence from the one they had started with. They were 2 hours north of Mudfoot Station, deep in the middle delta, where the channels ran wide and bronze in the afternoon light, when they rounded a reed point and found the fever boats. Not boats with fever on them, but boats carrying the fever's consequences. 3 flat cargo barges, all Havenbrook registered, tied up to the bank in a rough raft cluster, their cargo heaped and abandoned on the deck, the crews nowhere visible except for one man sitting on a dock plank rigged between 2 barges with his head in his hands. He looked up when the mudhen came around the point. It was a man named Tomas Seal, who ran a cargo operation out of Havenbrook's South Dock, and who Gideon had known since they were boys together learning the Delta's channels. "Tomas," Gideon said, bringing the mudhen in alongside. Tomas looked terrible. His eyes were ringed dark, his color was wrong, and his hands, when he lifted his head from them, were shaking in the fine, constant way that said exhaustion had long since become something else. "Do not come close," he said immediately. "We have got the fever in my crew, 2 of them, maybe 3, they are below." Gideon held the mudhen off. "How long?" 3 days. Tomas looked at the sky. 2 of them might make it. Calla Wren has got it bad. She will not see morning, I think." He paused. "I cannot move the cargo with 3 sick crew, and I cannot leave them. I cannot get anyone to help me. They see the flag on the barge and they turn away." He said it without blame, just with the flat exhaustion of someone who had spent 3 days watching the understandable become the unbearable. Gideon looked at Sharamph. She was watching Tomas with a focused attention. "We can take the cargo," Gideon said, "and we can get your crew north to the Havenbrook dock healer. The sick ones in the hold, separated. I know the protocols." "You do not have to, I know," Gideon said. "Come on." What followed was 2 hours of hard, careful work, moving Tomas's cargo across to the mudhen's deck, getting the 2 walking sick crew members settled in the mudhen's stern in the open air away from the hold, helping Tomas carry Calla Wren, who was a middle-aged dock woman with 3 days of cressworm fever burning in her, and a will to live that was fighting it tooth and nail. She was semi-conscious and very heavy and very sick, and they laid her on a bedroll in the bow with Tomas beside her and Sharamph, moving around the loaded mudhen checking lines and weight distribution with the natural competence of someone who has spent years in physical work. He watched her lift a 100-weight cargo crate one-handed to restack it and then look up at him from under the wind-blown fringe of her braid and say, "The weight is too far to port. We will run aground on the west sandbar if you have not dredged it recently." "I have not dredged it recently," he said. "Then we restack." They restacked. The mudhen rode differently now, lower, heavier, more careful but steady. He pushed north with the pole, and she came to the stern and helped him, taking a second pole from the deck locker, and working the opposite side with a strength that cut an hour off the time the loaded barge should have taken. They worked in near silence for a long time, him on the left side and her on the right, the poles rising and dipping in unison, and the mudhen moving north through the delta with its strange, overloaded mixture of cargo and sick crew, and 2 people who were discovering what it meant to work beside each other. At one point in a narrow channel section, he called out the bank depth to her, and she adjusted without needing him to explain why. At another point, she called out a submerged snag ahead, and he altered course without question. They did not discuss this. They simply did it. By the time the lights of Havenbrook stilt houses came into view in the late dusk, that particular scattered gold of a reed town at night, every lamp reflected double in the still dark water, Gideon felt something in his chest that was the physical sensation of not being alone, and it was so unfamiliar that he had to work to identify it. They brought the mudhen in to the Havenbrook dock to find that the town had worsened in their 2 days' absence. The fever had reached the main stilt settlement. There were 2 fever flags up on the south side of the water street, and the dock was less busy than it should have been at dusk, the usual evening commerce thinned out by fear. Pell's Factor House had its shutters closed. Bort had come north from his way station and was sitting on the main dock with a pipe, his face carrying the expression of a man who has received too much bad news to react to any particular piece of it. They unloaded Calla Wren and the 2 sick crew members and got them to the dock healer, a thin, competent woman named Argive, who took one look at them and began issuing orders with the crisp authority of someone who had been in this situation before and had a plan for it. She looked at Gideon when she had assessed Calla. "You brought them in," she said. "Tomas could not move the barge alone." Argive looked at Sharamph. Another of those measuring looks. Then she said, "There are 3 more in the east quarter with the fever. I cannot be in 4 places at once. If either of you have nursing experience—" "I have," Sharamph said immediately. "In the highlands, after battles, I know fever care." Argive held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then she nodded and led them to the east quarter. That night and the night after, Gideon and Sharamph worked alongside Argive and her single apprentice in the fever houses of Havenbrook's East Stilt quarter, doing the hard, unglamorous, essential work of fever nursing: cold water for the temperature, clear broth when the patient could swallow it, clean linen changed when it needed changing, the constant monitoring for the lung fill that was the cressworm's worst stage. Gideon was not without experience of this. His father's death had been a fever of a different kind, and he had been the one to sit with him. But Sharamph moved through the fever houses with a knowledge and a calmness that was both humbling and deeply reassuring. She talked to the patients. That was what he noticed most. Not just tended them, talked to them. Low, matter-of-fact conversation that was neither false comfort nor clinical reporting, but simply the presence of a voice that was interested in them specifically. An old dockman named Cress, who had been shivering alone in his stilt-room for 2 days before anyone found him, told her about his 30 years running the East Channels, and she listened with her full attention, and Cress's fever broke that night, which was probably a coincidence, but Gideon did not think entirely a coincidence. They slept in short stretches in the small hours of the morning, in the outer room of the fever house on rolled blankets that Argive's apprentice provided. The first night they slept on opposite sides of the room with the respectful distance of 2 people who are not yet sure what the space between them is. The second night, when Gideon came in from his last check at 2 in the morning and collapsed onto his blanket, he was aware that she was still awake on her side of the room, and he lay in the dark and said quietly, "Cress's fever broke." "I heard," she said. "How did you know what to say to him?" A pause. "I did not say anything particular," she said. "I just asked him about himself and listened. People who are sick and alone, they need to know they are still interesting to someone, that they still matter." He lay in the dark and thought about that. Then he said, "You are interesting to me." A long silence. "I know," she said. Her voice was quiet. "You are interesting to me." He did not move across the room. It was not the time for it. But he lay in the dark with that between them, and it was enough, more than enough. It was the kind of enough that had been missing from his particular life for a long time. On the 3rd day, the fever began to turn in Havenbrook. Calla Wren survived, which Argive said she had not expected. The 2 of Tomas's crew pulled through. 1 man in the East Quarter did not, and his body was taken out in the dawn on a small, quiet boat, the way the Delta took its dead. Gideon stood on the dock and watched it go, and Sharamph stood beside him and did not say anything and did not leave, and the 2 of those things together were the most honest comfort he could imagine. A week after their return to Havenbrook, with the fever numbers plateauing, and the town beginning to breathe again with the careful relief of people who have not entirely won but have stopped losing, Gideon was on the mudhen at the south dock doing the slow work of checking and recalking the deck boards. The same boards whose cousin had nearly killed him 2 weeks ago on the walkway. When Sharamph came down from the town with 2 cups of hot river tea from the stall at the dock's head, she handed him one without preamble and sat on the dock edge beside the mudhen, her legs hanging over the water, and they drank the tea in the afternoon light, and the sound of the Delta was all around them. "Vreth wrote," she said. "Good letter, good letter. The fever has not reached Mudfoot Station. The clan is well." She sipped her tea. "She asks if I am staying north." He was aware of the shape of the question beneath the surface of what she had said. He kept his eyes on the deck boards. "What did you tell her?" "I have not written back yet," she said. He looked up at her. She was watching the channel, her amber eyes following the slow movement of a reed-hull craft making its way north. The afternoon light was doing something significant to the angles of her face, the strong jaw and the faint green-gray of her skin catching the gold and holding it. And she was very beautiful in the way that things that are exactly themselves are beautiful without artifice, without effort, simply by being precisely what they are. He put his tea down and stood up, which brought him level with her where she sat on the dock edge, their faces almost at the same height for once. She turned to look at him and found him closer than she had expected, and a very small, quickly controlled start moved through her, and then she stilled and looked at him. "Tell her you are staying north," he said. She looked at him. Her amber eyes were dark and close and warm. "Ferryman," she said very quietly. "Gideon," he corrected. "Gideon," she said, testing it, and then, "I'm not a quiet life, you should know that. I'm not going to become a still river just because I am in a still river town." "I have never wanted a still river," he said. "I have spent 12 years on a river. I know exactly what a still river looks like, and it looks like nothing moving." She held his eyes for a long moment. And then she put her hand up and her palm found the side of his jaw, that same hand, the one that had closed on his arm on the cliffside walkway and not let go, and her thumb moved once along his cheekbone with a slowness that was entirely deliberate, reading his face the way she had read the channels. He reached up and covered her hand with his. His heart was doing something extraordinary. She leaned forward and her mouth found his in the afternoon light on the Havenbrook South Dock, with the delta moving around them and the sound of the reed birds, and the water and the creak of the mudhen against its moorings. And she kissed him with a warmth and intention that was neither tentative nor desperate, but was simply the most honest thing he had ever felt pressed against him. He kissed her back. When they separated, not far, not completely, she looked at him from very close up with those amber eyes and a look on her face that was new, that he had not seen on her before, which was satisfaction, and underneath it something very much like happiness. "I will write to Vreth," she said. "Write to Vreth," he said. She wrote to Vreth that evening. The letter she described to him later was brief. It said, "I am staying north. I have found my direction again. I will visit when the channels are clear." She had added one sentence at the end that she read to him with a composure that did not quite hide how much it had cost to write it. "I think I was looking for this all the way from the Highlands and did not know it until I arrived." Vreth's return letter took 10 days by the slow reed courier system, and when it arrived Sharamph opened it at the mudhen's stern while they were sitting in the evening light after a day's run, and she read it in silence for a moment, and then made a sound that was between a laugh and a sigh. "What does she say?" he asked. "She says she knew," Sharamph said. "She says that when you brought me in on the barge and she saw how you moved around the deck she knew you were the kind of man who would not be afraid of me." She paused. "She says orc women of my particular sort have been waiting for that specific kind of man for a long time, and most of us give up and become very angry about it eventually." He laughed. It came out bigger than he intended, and she looked at him with that not-quite smile again, which was by now entirely a smile. "Your particular sort," he said. "What sort is that?" "Apparently the kind who grabs foolish ferrymen off rotten walkways," she said. "In that case I am grateful I found one," he said. She looked at him sidelong. The late light was on the water. Somewhere north, Havenbrook's lamps were coming on. "Gideon," she said, "do you know what it means when an orc woman grabs a man and does not let go?" He thought about that. He thought about the walkway. He thought about the moment where he had been going over the edge and she had stopped him and the danger had passed and her hand had remained. "Tell me," he said. "In the old custom," she said carefully, "it is a claiming, not like ownership, more like declaration. When a Greenscar warrior pulls someone back from a fall and does not release them after the danger is past, it means they have decided on that person." She paused. "I did not do it consciously. I did it before I knew I was doing it. But Vreth says that the unconscious ones count more in the old reckoning." He was very still. "Sharamph, I am telling you this because you have a right to know," she said, which was an echo of what she had told him in the tavern at Thresh Landing about the raids, the same framework of honesty. He was a man who should know the full truth of his situation, and she was a woman who would make sure he had it. "You can decide what it means to you." "I am not," she turned to look at him directly, "I am not pressing a claim I have not earned. I know that is not how it works outside of Greenscar country." "How do you earn it?" he asked. She blinked. "What? In the old custom." How does the warrior earn the claim? She was quiet for a moment. By choosing the person again, she said, deliberately, by coming back to them, by saying it consciously, this time with full intention. She held his eyes. By not letting go even when there is no more danger and every reason in the world to let go. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Her fingers were long and strong and warm, and they closed around his without any hesitation. "Then it seems to me," he said, "that you have been earning it for 2 weeks." She looked at their joined hands and then at his face, and the thing that passed across her expression then was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The opening, that rare and unrepeatable opening, of a face that has been composed and guarded and careful for a very long time, simply opening, all the competence and the calm and the warrior's control still there, but moved aside for a moment to let something else through. He leaned in and kissed her again, in the evening on the barge with the Delta moving around them, and this time she pulled him close with a certainty that left no room for misunderstanding. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Gideon Winslow had experienced in the Delta, possibly in his life, and they were not best because they were easy. The fever was still moving through the settlement in its slow, retreating way, and the cargo routes were complicated by the quarantine rules, and the politics of the Delta were tense with the lingering residue of fear. But they were best because he was not running them alone. She went on the mudhen with him. Not every run, not as a passenger, but as a second pair of hands on a barge that had been designed for a crew of 2 and run by 1 for 6 years. She was a fast learner, and she was physically powerful, and she understood work in the deep, structural way of someone who had done a great deal of it for a long time in varied and demanding circumstances. She learned the South Channels first because she knew them from the 2 runs they had already done. Then he taught her the North and East Channels, the shallow runs and the deep ones, the places where the Delta's character changed depending on the season and the rain, the names of the spoil islands and the way station keepers, and the particular peculiarities of each dock approach. She taught him the old clan method of reading reeds for water depth, a thing he had heard of but never learned, which turned out to be as reliable as his sounding pole in many of the shallow eastern channels and considerably faster. She taught him 3 words in the old tongue, which he mispronounced with such consistency that she eventually developed a specific expression for it, a kind of affectionate suffering that he enjoyed producing. At night, in Havenbrook or at the way stations along the South Run, they talked. Long, ranging conversations that moved from the immediate, the Delta's politics, the cargo accounts, what Bort had heard from the northern settlements, to the larger and more personal. What it meant to live in a body that other people categorized before they spoke to you, what it meant to watch a parent die and find you had to rebuild your sense of purpose afterward, what courage actually felt like from the inside versus how it appeared from the outside, which Sharamph said was nothing like what observers assumed. "From the outside it looks like you are not afraid," she said one evening, the 2 of them in the mudhen's hold where the reed lamp made a small, warm world of its own against the night. "From the inside it is entirely about deciding what matters more than the fear." "What matters more than the fear for you?" he asked. She looked at him across the narrow space. "Changes," she said. "It changes." He understood from the way she said it that he was the current answer, and he did not need her to be more explicit than that. She was not a woman who said tender things often. She was a woman who demonstrated them with a hand at his shoulder when the day had been hard. With the particular way she positioned herself between him and the parts of the dock crowds that were still hostile, with the fact that she was always there when he came back to the barge. He learned to read her the way he read the channels, not by the explicit markers, but by the subtle ones, the small adjustments in current and depth that told you what was actually happening underneath the surface. What was happening underneath the surface was that she was deeply, particularly devoted to him, and had decided on him with the same complete and unsecond-guessed certainty that he had come to associate with everything she did. She did not waver. She did not perform uncertainty to seem more relatable. She had decided, and she was decided, and the completeness of it was the most extraordinary thing that had ever been given to him. He had been a man who had run the Delta alone, who had good accounts and a good route, and a barge that was his, and a life that was adequately full of purpose. He had told himself this was enough, and he had believed it in the way you believe things when you have never seen the alternative. Now he saw the alternative every morning when he woke in the barge's hold, and she was already up and moving at the stern, already looking at the channel the way she looked at it, like she was genuinely interested in what it would show her today. And the sight of her in the early light in her warriors' leathers with the braid loose and her amber eyes on the water was enough to make him understand that adequate is not a very high ceiling after all. The fever broke in Havenbrook in its full sense, the cases coming down, the fever flags removed one by one from the stilt houses, the dock traffic returning to its normal weight on a mid-autumn morning when the reeds had gone the color of old gold and the sky was a cold, clean blue above the flat brown water. Argive sent a runner to the Mudhen with a brief note. 6 cases resolved. No new cases in 4 days. Town is clear. Gideon read the note aloud to Sharamph on the barge. She listened, nodded once, and said, "Good." Then she looked at the clear sky. "We should run south while the weather holds." "We should," he said. They ran south that day, all the way to the Mudfoot station, because Sharamph had told Vreth she would visit when the channels were clear, and the channels were clear. It was a different run than the first time. The Delta in early autumn was a different animal than the Delta in summer, the light different, the birds different, the whole quality of the air changed. He poled and she stood at the bow, and the barge moved south through a world that seemed to have recovered its equilibrium, and it felt like the first clean day after a long illness. Vreth met them at the Mudfoot dock and gave Sharamph a long, assessing look, and then looked at Gideon and said something in the old tongue. "She says you look better than the last time," Sharamph translated deadpan. "Thank you," he said to Vreth. Vreth laughed, which was a wonderful sound, a big, rolling laugh with nothing held back in it. She clapped him on the shoulder in a way that would have staggered a smaller man and said, "Come and eat." They ate. The Mudfoot clan was out in force on the dockside in the autumn evening, pulling in a large reed harvest, and the energy of the settlement was entirely different from the tense, quarantine-edged atmosphere of Havenbrook. It was simply alive, busy in the way of a community that knows its purpose and is doing it. After the meal, when the reed lamps were lit and the water was dark and reflective around the stilt houses, Vreth took them both to the clan's meeting house, a large, warm, reed-roofed space at the center of the settlement, where the Mudfoot elders were gathered for the autumn council. She had arranged this, Gideon understood, though the arranging had been subtle and not something he had been explicitly informed of. The eldest of the Mudfoot elders was a woman named Gauk, who was very old and very small and had eyes that were so amber they were nearly orange. She looked at them both, at Sharamph, then at Gideon with a look that seemed to see about 4 layers beneath the immediate surface. Then she said in common tongue, "Vreth tells me you have been running the channels together." "For 2 months, Sharamph said. Gauk looked at Gideon. "And you, ferryman, what is she to you?" He answered without thinking about it, which was the only way he knew how to answer important questions. "She is mine," he said, "and I am hers, if she will have it that way." Sharamph looked at him sidelong. The not quite smile. Gauk looked at them for a long moment. Then she turned to the gathered elders and said something in the old tongue, and there was a brief, collective murmur. And then Gauk rose from her seat and took a length of braided reed cord from the table, orange and brown and dark green, twisted together, and held it out. "It is not the Greenscar custom," Gauk said. "It is the Mudfoot custom. Different clan, different form, but the meaning is the same." She looked at Sharamph. "Will you accept the Mudfoot binding for this man?" Sharamph looked at the cord. She looked at Gideon. Her amber eyes were very steady and very full. "Yes," she said. Gauk looked at Gideon. "Will you accept the binding with this woman?" "Yes," he said. He knew what this was, and he wanted it with a completeness he could not have described. Galk tied the cord once around both their wrists, a single knot, the Mudfoot way that said not possession but partnership, not authority but choice. The cord was warm from Galk's hands. The knot was tight enough to feel. Galk said something in the old tongue, and the elders responded in kind, and the meaning of it did not need translation, because the room was full of the specific warmth of people who are witnessing something good. Now, Galk said, the cord stays on until you decide to take it off. If you take it off, the binding releases. If you keep it on, the binding holds. That is the Mudfoot way. No ceremony will force you to stay, only your own will holds it. He looked at the cord on his wrist. He looked at the cord on her wrist. He looked at her. I am keeping it on, he said. I am keeping it on, she said, and there was no hesitation at all in her voice, and the amber of her eyes in the lamplight was the warm amber of firelight. After all, he thought, it had been that all along, only he had not been close enough to know it. Outside the meeting house, the Mudfoot clan made something of an occasion of it. In the unassuming way of a people who know how to celebrate without spectacle, good food set out on the dock tables. Voices lifted in one of the old clan songs that moved over the dark water like something alive. The reed lamps all lit along the waterfront, so that the whole settlement shone warm and orange against the black of the autumn delta. Gideon sat on the dock beside Sharamph with his leg pressed against hers, and the cord on his wrist catching the lamplight. And he ate the food, and listened to the singing, and felt the weight of her shoulder against his, and thought that there was no version of his life that he would have been able to predict this moment from. Not from the mudhen, not from the South Dock, not from the years of running alone on brown water under gray sky. It had been entirely outside the frame of what he had allowed himself to expect. He looked at her. She was watching the dark water, listening to the singing with her face open in a way that was still new, still something she gave him rather than the world at large, that particular openness, the unguarded version of her that existed only here, only now. Sharamph, he said. She turned and looked at him close, the way she had looked at him on the dock at Havenbrook on the day she had kissed him first. He did not have words exactly. He had the feeling, and he let it be on his face. And she read it the way she read everything, without needing it spelled out, without needing more than what was there. She lifted her wrist so the cord was visible between them, the orange and brown and green of it, and he lifted his wrist beside it so they were side by side in the lamplight. I did not let go on the walkway, she said quietly, as if it were something she had been keeping track of for a long time. I noticed that I did not let go after the danger was past. I noticed it too, he said. I think I knew then, she said. Something new. Something new, he agreed. She leaned in and put her forehead against his, and they sat like that on the Mudfoot dock with the singing around them, and the lamplight on the dark water and the cord on both their wrists, and the whole autumn delta breathed and settled around them with the sound of reeds in wind and the quiet, indifferent progress of the water going wherever water goes. The mudhen went back north the next morning. It always went back north. The route was the route, and the accounts were the accounts, and the delta needed its ferryman. But the mudhen went north with 2 people on it now, and the silence it carried was a different silence from the one it had carried for 6 years. Not the quiet of a man running alone on brown water, but the quiet of 2 people who have found the specific other person that their particular variety of alone had been waiting for. The reed banks moved past on both sides, and the great gray herons worked the shallows, and the sky was the cold, clear blue of a delta autumn morning. And on the stern of the flat-bottomed river barge that was not a beautiful boat and did not have a beautiful name, a man and a woman poled north through a world that had been difficult and frightening, and was now, this morning on this water, with the cord on both their wrists catching the early light, exactly enough. He looked at her from his side of the stern. She looked at him from hers. The pole rose and dipped, and the mudhen moved north, and the last thing between them was not distance but direction, and they were going the same way. She had caught him at the edge, and she had not let go. He had taken her hand on the dock in the afternoon light, and he had not let go. And neither of them, standing at the stern of a barge moving north through a gold-reeded delta in the early morning of what felt very much like the rest of their lives, intended to let go now.